What's up guys, Manny here, welcome back to the channel. It's time to continue with the conditioning series in which I want to share some tips and tricks for increasing the chance of a good day, to send a limit project or to try a super hard on-site or whatever you have in mind. And today's topic is going to be restedness, which of course influences the performance of your climbing on any given day to some extent. Before we start, as always, a few words about the background footage of this episode. Recently Bernd and I went to Kyparissi, which is a pretty nice spot, a pretty nice village actually, about 1 hour by car to the south of Leonidio, at the east coast of the Peloponnese as well. And it features an amazing limestone crag with world-class tufa climbing and an incredible view over the sea. And our plan was to stay there for a couple of days, doing some routes and maybe some bolting. But as we arrived, we realized that almost all the routes were completely wet, and as if that wouldn't have been enough, we got caught in a super intense thunderstorm when we arrived at the crag, so see yourself. Alright, let's get started. From the 4 major internal factors, body weight, mental sharpness, restedness and special substances, I picked restedness for today's episode, and right from the beginning I want to say that in my opinion, restedness is a bit overrated by a lot of climbers. I believe that it is significantly less important than the topics of body weight and mental sharpness, for example, which we discussed previously, and I will tell you why I believe so in a second. Because first I need to determine what I'm actually talking about when I say resting, since this word appears in a few different contexts when it comes to climbing, depending on how far you zoom in or out of the timeline. So let's start with the close-up. Here we have the rests of a certain problem, an endurance route for example, which must be utilized by the climber with the question how long and where should the climber rest in order to get to the top. But this kind of resting has more something to do with the current fitness and resting technique and maybe attempt strategy, so to say, rather than having an influence on your conditioning, although it might be influenced by your conditioning. Thus, it shall be the topic of another video. So let's zoom out a bit. Now we can ask ourselves the question, how long should the climber rest in between individual attempts for ideal recovery? And at which time of the day should the attempts be executed for optimal performance? This sounds much more like conditioning for the perfect go, so we're going to take a look at it during this episode. If we zoom out even more, we can ask ourselves, how many rest days should a climber make in order to create the perfect day? And where should this peak day be placed considering the current training regimen? Sounds very much like conditioning to me, so we will take a look at this one as well. And if we zoom out even more, we can ask ourselves when and if we should place longer resting periods at some point during the training year in order to give the body some time to recover from the training, and if they should last 1 or 3 weeks, for example. But since this has very little to do with creating the perfect attempt, it will yet again be the topic of another video. So let's zoom back in again. How long should a climber rest in between attempts, and should they take place in the morning or in the evening? And will the first attempt be the best one, or the second, or the third, or even the 10th? I will be totally honest with you guys, in my experience it almost doesn't matter when attempts take place during a day if we exclude external conditions like sun, temperature, wind and humidity. And interestingly, it doesn't even matter if it's the first or the 10th go of the day, at least if you're obeying all the other conditioning laws. Most of you will probably disagree with me on that one. A lot of my climbing mates do so too, and it might well be that I'm a bit of a special case in this regard, but just recently another one of those days occurred where the laws of restedness seemed to be completely inverted. The more goes I made, the stronger I felt, until I could finally send my 8B Plus project on the 7th go of the day. On some other days though, everything develops normally, and my second go is the best one, and from there it's basically going downhill. And because I'm writing a training diary since over 4 years, I know that under the bottom line there is no significant difference in occurrence between these two cases. I can add here that this also depends on the style of your project, with the overall impression that I can do more good goes per day in a bouldery test piece than in a super pumpy endurance monster, although I can recall the one or the other exception from this rule as well. The moral of the story is, don't give up too soon. On some days you might surprise yourself just when you thought your climbing day is already over. Just don't smash in your post-workout meal before it's done. However, what will definitely have an influence on your performance is the duration of the resting periods in between your attempts. Here it is where we actually can do the major mistakes, in my opinion. Although I can't really tell you a golden rule or something which always works, I can tell you some of the factors which influence your ideal resting duration and how they influence it, so that you will be able to find the sweet spot yourself next time at your project. So first, we've got how you actually feel when you're just coming down from your previous attempt. Obviously, the more exhausted you are, the more rest you will need. The second thing is the character of the problem. I have the impression that short and bouldery problems need less resting time in between attempts than long, pumpy endurance stuff. The third contributor is external conditions. When it's very cold, it is better to keep the rest short so that your fingers aren't freezing the next time you start an attempt. Also, I have the impression that the body forgets faster about previous attempts when it's colder. Finally, your resting time will also be influenced by what type of climber you are. And here I have the impression that pure boulderers tend to need longer rests than endurance specialists, regardless whether the project is a route or a boulder. It might have something to do with the generally greater aerobic endurance in the endurance specialists, resulting in a quicker recovery in between performance outputs, so to say. All in all, I believe that ideal resting time in between attempts varies greatly and can range from some 5 minutes up to an hour or even longer. In very long cases, it will make sense to even throw in a little warm-up again before you start the actual attempt. Fuck, there was another one. Alright, so let's zoom out a bit more so that we can take a look at how we should handle rest days and training days in order to create the perfect day. And yet again, I will have to disappoint you. For me, it doesn't really matter if it's the first climbing day after 2 rest days or the 5th day on. I've had extremely good and extremely bad days in both cases with no significant difference in occurrence. Other conditioning factors seem to be much more important for me, but yet again, this seems to be rather the exception from the rule. Most climbers will argue that if not the first, the second day on is their best one, and from there it always goes downhill. However, there are some things you should pay attention to when planning the perfect attempt on a day level. The first thing that I want to mention here is that at least for me it almost never works out if I try the same project on 2 consecutive days. Either I will send it on the first day, or I will need at least 1 day in between my next attempt filled with either resting or at least trying something different. I rarely send a project by trying it again on the 2nd consecutive day, if that makes sense. I have the impression that the body obtains a project-specific destruction if you try your project a couple of times, and although you might not feel super tired on the next day, exactly those little tiny muscle fibers you need for this specific project are a little bit more exhausted than usually, decreasing your chance for sending the project on a 2nd consecutive day. So either make a rest day or just try something different on that day and come back later with a gap of at least 1 day. To give you an example, if I encounter 2 routes on a trip, which I have the impression that I will need 2 days for sending them, I will simply try the first one on the first day, the second one on the second day, and hopefully I will send the first one on the 3rd day and the second one on the 4th day. You can of course just as well throw a rest day in the middle if you have the feeling you need one, and in this case you will send your stuff on the 4th and on the 5th day. Another thing I've noticed is that intense max power sessions or power endurance sessions demand bigger resting periods than anything else. This seems to be especially significant when it comes to hangboarding. When I conduct a max power hangboard session on 1 day, I will have a very hard time sending my project on the next day. I will need at least 1 day in between of resting or doing something else. Sometimes I have the impression that a gap of 2 days works even better. And the same is true for intense strength endurance sessions. And if it's not like that, I probably didn't train properly. So keep that in mind when planning your perfect day. Max power and power endurance stimuli need more rest to recover completely. And finally, some advice I already gave in the context of mental sharpness. It is absolutely key to get your sleep in if you want to make full use of your resting time. Sleep well and long in at least 3 consecutive days before the critical day, and I tell you, you will wake up and feel like a superhero. This one might in fact be much more important than if you had a rest day or not. Did you actually have some rest nights or not? And with this advice I want to end this conditioning episode. I hope you've got something from it. If you did, please drop some likes and comments. What's your opinion about resting? How important is it according to your experience? And as always, thank you guys for your attention, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.